Hi everyone, I'm Asia, one of the medical. Oh, hi everyone, I'm Asia, one of the medical directors here at London Wide. I think I've already made a slight mix-up there. Here we are, right there we are. I think we can all see the funding. Great. So in the next 10 minutes, you're going to get an insight into the GP contract finances for this year, the headlines, are there any gains, what the transfers, losses, where there have been any changes or no changes, and what that really means for you in terms of global sum per patient. So the headline contract numbers, you will have seen the letter from Amanda Doyle, who's the National Clinical Director of Primary Care and Community Services that was released in the latter part of February of this year, which really demonstrated that there is a £485 million funding increase overall, which includes £69 million into the DES, representing, as her letter stated, a 3.6% cash increase. And that's before inflation is taken into account. But when inflation is taken into account, that's 1.4% real terms growth, bringing the total value of the contract to £13.863 billion. So that sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But let's actually break that up. What does that really mean when we take it apart? So 416 million of that global sum itself is pertaining to a £260 million uplift, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, the effects of inflation and the DDRB assumptions around that uplift. 121 million of that is for list growth pressures, 25 million for additional QOF money. I mean, it did say circa in Amanda's letter for 18 new indicators, which you'll get an insight about later, and 11 million pounds into the statement and financial entitlement, the SFE, for local reimbursement. So that's your 416 into global sum, and 69 million goes into the PCN DES. 53 million of that is the ARRS salary uplift alone. But this is still good, doesn't it? I mean, you can think, well, actually, that on the surface of it sounds great. Well, you're going to learn, and we're going to talk through, actually, is it good enough? So where does that leave us? And I just want to really highlight an article that was published about a few weeks ago in the Health Service Journal. Some of you may be familiar with this journal. It's a journal particularly for hospital managers, and does on occasion touch on general practice spend. Now, this article highlighted three critical things, really: that the share of funding for general practice is falling. And if you look at this chart here on the right, the blue areas here, so if we look at it, actually, it's based on sector. So you've got specialised services, and this is here, I hope you can see my cursor, is primary care. And I want you to look at primary care, general practice, i.e., and here the acutes. And this is the percentage of total NHS spend, and that's based on the accounts for NHS England. In general practice, we have 8.3% of the total share, and that's at its lowest since 2015. Only 5 years ago, in the peak of the pandemic, that total spend was 9.2%. But interestingly here, when you look at the acute spend, it's actually increased by 4% of the budget in comparison to the last decade. So that's somewhat worrying, given that general practice delivers 90% of activity within the NHS for only now 8.3% of the funding. And the other thing to note in this article is that the proportion of NHS doctors who are GPs is at a decade-long low point, at 15% of the workforce. When compared to 2015, that was 21%. So we are in a bit of a crisis here. I want to now spend some time just looking very briefly at that inflationary uplift that we referred to earlier. So Doyle's letter really looks at the inflationary uplift relative to the GDP deflator. And we have looked and just taken that apart a little bit to see, well, how is this calculated? The GDP deflator is a measure of the economy-wide inflation. It covers all goods and services produced in the UK, including government services and investment. But the real world practice expense costs that we see more closely track the CPI, the Consumer Price Index tool. And that really reflects a fixed basket of goods and services. It captures rises in utilities, estates and costs, and day-to-day operating expenses. And it takes into account cost of living, which the GDP doesn't. It doesn't cover staff, but the DDRB and the Agenda for Change, the AFC, cover that later, and we'll look at that. So the GDP deflator almost always underestimates the real-world cost pressures that are faced by general practice, often by significant sums. And this is what's been used in the contract that's been presented to us. So if we look at that and dig deeper a little bit here around what does that mean for the numbers. So the uplift using the GDP deflator was 260 million. But if the CPI had been used, which takes into account the cost of living, the uplift would have been closer to 428 million pounds. So that gives you a deficit of 168 million pounds that should have gone into the contract that actually isn't in the contract. So if we accept that the real world rise in costs is actually 428 and not the 260 uplift in the that's been presented, the real term growth actually is only 0.26%, not the 1.4% claimed by the Department of Health and Social Care. And that's really supposedly there to pay for all the extra workload, which you'll hear about in the rest of these slides around the contract. This really here is just if you want to play around with it a little bit to understand the Bank of England inflation calculator, and you can look at this to look at how the costs increase year on year, and you can play around and tap into that should you wish. So I'm going to spend some time now looking at the transfers of what's actually gone into the contract. There's been a lot of money moving around. Effectively, the government have taken a significant sum of money, that's 292 million pounds from the PCN-DES and put it into core, but with strings attached. This is not new money, and if people were already receiving this and using it to fund the running costs of other staff, it's actually going to leave them in a sticky position, as it can now only be used to fund extra GP sessions. What this means in practice, we still don't yet know, as the contract details are yet to be published. But what we do understand that this 292 million pounds was originally intended to support the formation of new neighbourhoods, but that was then diverted back into practices with other strings attached. So that's just important to note there. And then the 82 million pounds has also been moved into core from the Retired Advice and Guidance Scheme. What's important to recognise here that this scheme is planned for a massive scope in the next year. There's going to be a huge extension to it, and there's no new funding attached. So what that means in practice, and what we'll start hearing, we can just imagine, is that this will become expected for us to do because it's in the core funding. So we need to recognise that while that sounds great on paper, actually there's more to come in relation to what the expectations are for general practice. Losses, very little, a very small amount has disappeared from QOF, and a large amount has been added, the 18 indicators. £7 million has been lost from the Retired Weight Management Enhanced Service, though there are some new QOF points for weight management. And what does the global sum consist of? So I just want to spend some time trying to understand, well, when we talk about the global sum, what does it actually mean? So it's supposed to consist of three parts. The first being the contractor partner pay at 31%, the staff costs at 53%. But important to note here that a BMA survey last year only suggested that the real figure of staffing was actually closer to 72% than the 53% of global sum. And then other expenses. It's clear that global sum no longer really truly covers the cost of practices, and that's what we hear certainly within our LMCs from the practices on the ground. We're dependent on QOF, we're dependent quite a lot of PCN-DES income and discretionary incomes where they still exist, such as locally commissioned services to enable us to function. The government uses that 53%, which I've touched on, but it might be worth checking your own percentage of staff costs over global sum. And if your staff percentage costs are lower than 50%, 53%, you gained slightly more than the headline numbers. If higher, you will lose out. So that's just worth for you to test out your positioning on that. So what does this really mean for you? That these are now new numbers, given that the DDRB agreement has been agreed by the government of 3.5%. So this will now increase the global sum per patient of £130.07. And there's an uplift of £6.73 or 5.5%. But it's really important to note here that this remains unweighted, as Car Hill has not yet been applied. And within the London region, assuming most of the GPs and practice members here are London practices, that there's an additional £2.18 per patient if a patient's registered within the GLA, the Greater London Authority. Just want to say that if you're going to think about one slide and one thing to really go away and look at from the finance perspective, it's worth really familiarising yourself with the Statement of Financial Entitlement, also known as the SFE, because it really sets out the reimbursements that practices are entitled to claim for. So this has been static for many years until last year, where there was an uplift for locum reimbursement by 3.5%. But interestingly, for immunisations, there has been no increase or change in the item of service for vaccination programmes such as COVID and influenza, which remains at £10.06. One can reflect that back and say, well, it's almost as if the government is trying to disincentivise us from undertaking them. You can think and share your reflections and what your thoughts are on that, but that's worth really looking into. And then the other financial matters, I've mentioned that prior to the DDRB reporting, the estimated staff uplift was 2.5%. But 3.5% has been accepted by the government, which is positive. The out-of-hours deduction remains the same, of the global sum of 4.7%, and the actual figure is £6.11. Got a couple more slides on here. Other financial matters, ARRS GP has been uplifted by 3.5%. For other staff, it's been uplifted by 3.3%, matching the Agenda for Change uplift. The enhanced access element of the PCN-DES has also been uplifted by 3.5%, and there are an additional 18 QOF points worth £25 million, which will be showcased after it might be on finance. So what's remained unchanged? Some things do remain unchanged. CQC fees continue to be reimbursed at 100%, and the learning disabilities health check at £140 a patient, and the network participation also does remain unchanged as well. So this is where we leave our brief run through the new contract, but in summary, you've just got a real whiz through there of the contract finances for 26-27, the headline contract numbers, looking at inflation, transfers, losses, and global sum. And the reflections, in essence, is that funding is effectively static. Workload is rising faster than the resource, which has been demonstrated by what we've just shared thus far. PCN-DES has lost a big chunk of funding, but it's been given back to us with strings attached. And if there's one thing of the contract you should familiarise yourself with, it most certainly is the Statement of Financial Entitlements.